Nasser, I want to start with just asking you, when you see these pictures, when you're watching these pictures of these Israeli hostages being released, being returned to the Israeli military in the first instance, but obviously, of course, later to their families, and when you see these busloads of Palestinian prisoners heading back home as well, how does that make you feel?
Look, there's a feeling of joy. We don't believe anybody should be held hostage, not a Palestinian nor an Israeli. And I think, following on what your previous guest was just saying, this is a complete vindication of the Palestinian resistance. And when we talk about what Israel's goals were, as he said, to eliminate Hamas, to get the hostages back, what has been shown, it never was about that. What it was about is Israel making Gaza uninhabitable, with a view to what Donald Trump was trying to aid Benjamin Netanyahu in doing, is ethnically cleansing Gaza. So whilst we are, feel joy and happiness that the Palestinians are going home, that these Israelis are also going home, we can't but be heartbroken by a world that has abandoned the humanity of Palestinians. But also, when you look at those images of the Palestinians standing so resolute and so proud, it's uplifting because it proves that the spirit of the Palestinians is unbroken and unconquered, and our faith in the strength of an indigenous people to stay connected to their lands is well placed.
I mean, Nasser, obviously you've used some big words there. On the one hand, the pictures that we've seen coming from Gaza, I think, speak for themselves. On the other hand, these are cases that will be going forward in international tribunals. Having seen what we've seen so far, with these exchanges basically happening relatively straightforwardly, does that leave you optimistic about the next phases of the ceasefire deal, which of course are likely to be even more challenging given, that demand for a full Israeli withdrawal, for a complete cessation of hostilities? Does that leave you optimistic, or do you think, we can't judge what will happen next on what we've seen so far?
Look, I've been in the Palestine advocacy business my entire life. I know absolutely we can't trust Israel. Israel has a history of breaking ceasefires. Israel's got a history of Palestinians ceasing and Israel continuing to fire. If we look at the West Bank, what's happening in Jenin, what's happening in Tulkarm, even in Gaza, there is no question that Israel has not stopped its genocidal campaign, but there is a momentary pause, and you see the outpouring of spirit and hope of the Palestinians. It's a beautiful thing, and the world should embrace the beauty of this Palestinian spirit and not leave it to a compromised and destitute, destroyed enclave like Gaza is today, for the Palestinians to endeavour to negotiate with a nuclear power. It's time for the international community to engage correctly, properly, and actively in Palestine to force Israel to comply with international law.
And Nasser, given what we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks, pretty much since the ceasefire came into force in the West Bank, which of course you mentioned there, do you feel like there's been some kind of below-board arrangement there in terms of the West Bank, in terms of perhaps getting some kind of ceasefire for Gaza, but then allowing there to be more violence in the West Bank, or is that just way too much speculation?
Look, I think, if you're in the Palestine business, speculating is what we do. There's no question that there must be some sort of green light has been given to Benjamin Netanyahu to continue these operations. I mean, if America was interested in peace, they'd stop sending weapons. Since Donald Trump has come into power, he has lifted the sanctions on some extreme settlers. He's lifted the Biden. One of the only things Genocide Joe did during his presidency was to slow down some of the more egregious weaponry. We've seen Donald Trump lift that. So I don't think we can not speculate that there's some sort of agreement. And arguably, one might say Donald Trump was looking for Benjamin Netanyahu not to spoil his party. So, his inauguration, and the quid pro quo was you can have a run at the West Bank. This is not really speculation. It's borne out to be truth in so many different ways.
And finally, Nasser, you mentioned that you've been in Palestinian advocacy for many years, and given what's happened, you know, your quest is certainly not going to end anytime soon. What are the key things that you're working on right now in terms of advocacy, in terms of Gaza, in terms of the ceasefire? What are you doing and how are you going about that?
Yeah, so I think it's an obligation on any Palestinian advocate in the West to press on. And I say press on. Israel enjoyed an impunity, a normalcy, if you will, as a nation amongst the normal, quote unquote, nations in the world. The world has seen that Israel is not normal. The world has seen what Zionism is. The world has seen just how racist and genocidal that country is. And that normalcy that it enjoyed, that the West conferred upon it militarily, diplomatically, and in the media, has been shattered. And it's our job in the West to press on and make sure that we don't allow it to restore its image. The synonym that is, I know in people under 30 years of age today, when they hear the word Israeli or Israel, that's a synonym for massacre, genocide, and death. It's our job to continue that, and our job to advocate in our spaces to increase awareness around the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. It's important consumers boycott Israeli products. It's important that funds management, those people with decision-making powers, divest from Israeli entities, and that as countries we are advocating for our governments to sanction apartheid Israel until it complies with international law.
I wondered, as an advocate for Palestine and Palestinian rights, what your hopes are for the future of Gaza and for the future of the enclave. What would be a kind of best outcome scenario for you in terms of governance and security for the 2 and a bit million people who live there?
Well, what we want to see is the immediate cessation of the siege. You know, for 17 years before October 7, 16 years before October 7, Israel had a land, air, sea blockade of this enclave. And we should say just how tiny this little space is, 365 square kilometres, a population density of over 5,000 people per square kilometre. Often people don't realise just how dense that is. That is as dense as any city, high-rise city like New York City, etc. Schools are running 3 shifts a day. We need the complete ending of that siege so that Palestinians can practice self-determination. The rebuilding of Gaza must be done by Palestinians and aided by people who want to help Palestinians. It must not be moderated by, it must not be controlled by, and Israel must not be allowed to profit in the rebuilding of Gaza. So there should be, in the first instance, I believe, a port built that allows for aid to come directly to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians should have the right to self-determine who will be their leaders, how it will be led, etc. It's time for the Palestinians to be free.
And what needs to happen then in terms of Israel and the Israeli mood, the narrative inside Israel for that to be able to happen? Because there'll be many people in Tel Aviv, in settlers, for example, who would think, no, that's not going to leave us safe. That's not going to leave us and our children secure. So how do you change hearts and minds there?
Well, it's not our job to change Israeli hearts and minds. What we need to do is address the root issue. The root concern is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Israelis might enjoy peace and security, but it's predicated on the very simple notion of continued Palestinian oppression. Zionism, as it's manifested itself, was a Jewish homeland, but that Jewish homeland didn't come for free or at no cost. This Jewish homeland came at the expense of Palestinians. It came at the oppression of Palestinians, and it came at the continued devastation of Palestine and the Palestinian people. That's no right. Nobody has the right to do that. And Zionism, as it's manifested itself, must be corrected. So Israelis feeling that Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian hopes are predicated on Israeli safety is just an absurd notion. Palestinians have a right to be safe. The Israelis have to end the occupation, and they have to end this supremacist notion that they are a chosen people and that they have the sole right to the Holy Land. All of Abraham's children have a right to that land from the river to the sea. It's called Palestine, and everyone should be free there, not just Jewish people.
I mean, you say that, but if you don't engage with Israeli people who think that, surely you have no chance of ending the oppression. If you don't explain to them and talk to them about other points of view, how are they supposed to step outside their own existence and their own understanding of the world and appreciate these other opinions? Surely, as an advocate, you have to engage with Israelis on this.
Respectfully, a country can't perpetuate a genocide like we've seen. The nuclear-armed state with a defense minister that said he is dealing with human animals, that a country of 6 million people or 7 million people can cut off the food, gas, electricity and water to a captive 2 million people and think that we are equal or that we are human. There is nothing a Palestinian can do to make a Zionist or an Israeli feel safe and secure. The world needs to engage in the dismantling of this supremacist ideology. In South Africa, we saw a white supremacist ideology that enjoyed all of the fruits and comforts that Israel enjoys today. Civil society all over the world said, you can't have a system where whites, one people, based purely on the color of their skin, oppresses another. Well, in this situation inside Palestine, we have one people who celebrate God on a different day, having all the rights, oppressing another people simply because they celebrate their God on a different day, on Friday as Muslims or on Sunday as Christians. We have to end that. And what needs to happen is the world has to create the situation where, just like in apartheid South Africa, suddenly whites went, we are excluded from the world, we cannot participate in sporting events, nobody's doing any trade with us. We have to reform our system. And just as all of the apartheid supporters in South Africa suddenly believed in equal rights, so too, when forced to, when isolated, when diplomatically and economically isolated, Zionists will give up this supremacist ideology. No Palestinian that's oppressed under the boot of an Israeli occupier is able to convince the person in that boot to take the boot off their throat. We need the goodwill and good efforts of the international community to push that foot off our throats. And I would add that whilst Palestinians might be under that boot of oppression, the Israeli that's in that boot is also trapped. They might think they're free, but they're not free. They are not free. Palestinians will resist and will fight for their right to self-determination, as they should and must.
All right, Nasser Mashni from the Australia Palestine Advocacy Network, thank you so much.